Hi, everyone. I'm Dee Marley along with my co host,
Michael Zucker.
and you're listening to the History Bards podcast. Welcome to all of our listeners. Today, we have the privilege of welcoming historical author Sarah V. Barnes to the show. Hi, Sarah. How are you today?
I'm great, and I'm so pleased to be here.
Thank you so much for being here. And for our listeners, just as a way of introduction, when Sarah is not writing stories, she practices and teaches horseback riding as a meditative art. She holds a PhD in history from Northwestern University and spent many years as a college professor before turning full time to writing and writing. She has two grown daughters and lives with her husband, her dogs, and her horses near Boulder, Colorado. She is currently working on books 2 and 3 of the She Who Rides Horses trilogy. And before we get started, I have to say immediately to our listeners that they should go to her website at www.sarahvbarnes.com and read Sarah's bio. It is by far one of the most creative bios I've read. I really enjoyed it.
I'm so glad.
Good. And because I read your bio, Sarah, it has really piqued my curiosity about this story and why you got into writing historical fiction. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. As you noted, for many years, I was a history professor teaching college level. And at a point when my two daughters were old enough to begin horseback riding lessons, I revived a childhood passion, which was being around horses. And before long, we were deeply involved, and I was starting to teach riding. And I got to a point where I would rather be at the barn than in a college classroom. And so I left academia and I turned full time to teaching riding and training horses. And along the way, I had a equine partner who could not do what I thought my goals were for my own competition. And I was so attached to her that I just decided to follow whatever path this mare was going to take me down, even if it wasn't in line with what I thought were my goals in a competitive sense.
Right.
And she led me really on a spiritual journey. And along the way, I encountered one of my mentors, Linda Kahonov, who actually wrote the afterword for the book. And she is the author of The Tao of Equus and one of the founders of Equine Facilitated Therapy and Learning. And I started attending workshops with Linda and became eventually one of her instructors. One of the workshops that I attended was actually a writing workshop. And although I didn't have any grand ambitions as a writer, I just enjoyed attending her workshops, and so decided to head down to her place in Tucson. And at this workshop, on about the third day, we'd spent quite a bit of time with the horses doing exercises designed to sort of awaken our creativity and intuition. And she, at the end of the day, said, okay, I just want you to go out, find a place to sit on the property. I'm going to turn the horses loose and just write whatever comes. And we don't need to reconvene. We'll get together again in the morning, stay as long as you want, and just see what comes. And so I sat down, opened my laptop, poised my fingers over the keyboard, and started writing. And this whole story started to pour out of me. And I kept writing. This huge supermoon came up over the mountains behind Linda's ranch, kept writing. In the morning, I had the whole first chapter of what became the book.
Awesome.
And I read it to my fellow workshop participants and to Linda, and she cried, which was always a good sign. She said, I've been waiting for someone to tell this story, and you need to keep on writing. And so that's what I did. And really for several months, it was a very similar experience. I'd sit down to write with no idea what was coming next, and just wonder, where's the story going to take me today? Eventually, I did take a step back and actually do the research, and have really tried to combine as accurately as possible the story of how humans and horses really domesticated each other with what is fundamentally meant to be a story. So sometimes I tell people it's kind of Clan of the Cave Bear meets My Friend Flicka.
Right.
And that's how it all got started.
Oh, that's really amazing. And isn't that it's so wonderful when that happens, when it all clicks together, the research and the story, it just kind of all clicks and it's like it's meant to be. And so I have to ask you, what kind of horses do you have?
Right now, I have Lusitanos, and that's a Portuguese breed,
Right.
very old breed, originally trained to fight bulls.
Yeah, that's awesome. I used to have saddlebreds, so I really understand that connection with horses because they can be very inspirational.
Absolutely.
Michael?
Yeah, one question I was thinking of is, yes, I mean, there's Westerns, but within historical fiction more broadly, I guess, how common are, stories centering either animals or horses in particular, do you think? I mean, is what you're doing, particularly unique in the genre? I mean, it's a story that I not have thought to tell.
I know that there's one movie, the title escapes me, that is the story of a dog being domesticated. So again, kind of a prehistorical setting, and again, but that was a movie.
Yeah.
And there are plenty of stories, I think, set in the past that involve animals. Black Beauty comes to mind. But yeah, it is kind of a unique genre in that sense. And again, I mentioned Clan of the Cave Bear, and that probably comes the closest. And there are horses in one of the subsequent books in that series, little ahistorical in terms of the timing, but again, I feel like this story has been gifted to me, and I have a responsibility to tell it, but it's not really my story.
Right. So, in that vein, can you tell our listeners what your story is about?
Sure. So it is the story of the first person to ride a horse. So it tells the story of Naya, and she is the daughter of a clan chief, and they herd cattle, sheep, and goats in the steppe of what is now southern Russia. And she is a little bit of a rebel, a little bit of a outcast among her peers, partly because of her appearance, partly because of her character, which is a little different from the other girls, but the other boys don't really want her company, so she spends a lot of time by herself. And she develops this fascination for the horses, and particularly a red filly, who she discovers one day, and she herself has red hair, which again is historically accurate, where that gene comes from red hair.
Right.
And so then the story is really about how she and the red filly develop a real connection and a relationship. And there's a bit of a mystical element. There's some drama and intrigue and danger. And her goal is eventually to be able to ride this horse, which is a very sort of revolutionary dream to have, because no one has had that thought before. Humans and horses had a long history up to that point, mostly as predator and prey. But this was a different way to think about the relationship between humans and horses. And then, of course, once that relationship started to develop, our histories have been entwined ever since.
Yes, absolutely. I'm really, really curious, and I'm sure Michael is too, about the research that you did. Like, was there anything really obscure that you discovered in your research, or maybe just the research itself?
Yeah, well, and one of the advantages I have to say in writing fiction that is set as far in the past
Yeah.
as my story, which is set in 4000 BCE,
Right.
is that there is only so much evidence currently available, and more research is always being done. And luckily, and again, one of those sort of mystical, slightly surprising things about the story is that details that I included have subsequently been validated by research.
That's great.
But part of why I got frustrated with being an academic historian is I seem to have gotten further and further away from the stories,
Yeah.
which is what interested me in history in the first place. And so as an historian, or an archaeologist or an anthropologist or a linguist, all these fields that I was drawing research from, you really are constrained
Yes.
by the evidence that's available.
Right.
And then there's what really happened in the past, which we can never actually know.
Right.
And in between those two things, there's a gap. And that gap is where imagination gets to live. And so as the writer of creative historical fiction, I can be in that gap. And so if there's something that is not available in the research, and I've done my best to figure as much out as I can, and I still don't know, I can make it up.
Right. And isn't that
and
the best?
so in some ways, being a writer of prehistorical fiction is easier, I think, than more recent eras where there's so much information available. And if you're trying to be accurate, you can almost get mired in the details. So in my case, there is that gap, and I can quite happily live there.
Oh, that's great. Because it's like that's been one of my questions before in the past about, how much the ethics about writing about historical figures, because there is a sort of ethics that you have to have about staying true to who they were. But you're just completely free of that. And I think that just allows for a creativity that a lot of people don't have who are historical fiction authors. That's
yeah,
great.
so I am very appreciative of that, while also trying to tell a story that's as accurate as possible.
Of course.
If you don't mind me asking, so in your approach to writing, I guess, with this book and the subsequent volumes, how do you approach, character versus plot, or dialogue versus description? Like, how do you kind of weed through those elements, and do you prefer some elements over others?
That's a great question. And really, as a novice creative writer, when I started this process, I've really had to depend on the talents of my very gifted editor. I can remember handing her the first draft of the manuscript and getting comments back about point of view. And I was kind of like, what's point of view? So I had quite a bit to learn. And that's one of the things, you bring up the balance between description and dialogue and character development and plot and all those things. She's really been a fabulous guide in kind of how to balance all those elements. I think my way of envisioning the story really is quite cinematic. I don't aspire to write a screenplay, but that said, I take kind of a visual approach of creating the landscape almost as a character through description, and then coming into the characters and establishing the setting, but then the dialogue between them, and building the story scene by scene. So that's the best way that I can describe it is that in my mind, it's like I'm narrating a movie that I'm watching.
Yeah, that's a very good technique to use. And
So
let me
it's
pause
just
for a second. So, if for some reason it goes out because we had that like mishap at the very beginning, I'm going to send you another link so that we can finish in case this goes out, because I wanted you to have the full 30 minutes. And that
Okay.
we, and so for some reason, again, I apologize for that, but we will get it if it goes out, and I'll send you another link to your email, and we'll finish up on the rest of the questions. But we'll just keep going
Okay.
until it tells us that we can't go anymore.
All right.
Okay.
I guess I'll go.
Yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
yeah, because I mean, you're saying that, you kind of picture it as a film, and it's just, as a fellow historical fiction writer, your thoughts on this, that sort of the relationship between novels and film as two separate art forms, but similar enough that they're sort of linked to each other, that I think a lot of writers, when they're writing, they know, it's hard not to be influenced by film as another storytelling art form and bringing it into your work. But at the same time, so many films are inspired by novels, including historical fiction novels, just like that type of relationship. And if you have any, thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that we naturally, as readers, like to use all of our senses.
Mhm.
So I've heard reading and writing described as a shamanic act,
Hmm.
in the sense that you become immersed in an alternate reality, a different place of consciousness. And so that in the sense that being immersed in a film or being immersed in a novel, the best writers and the best filmmakers engage all of our senses. So
Yeah.
it's not just that we're hearing a dialogue, but we're seeing, we're smelling, we're tasting. We want to be completely immersed from the standpoint of all of our senses in the story. And so you're right, there is this sort of natural affinity between certain types of novels and film. And of course there are many other ways to uh, write creative fiction, but I think particularly a narrative is bound to have those similarities with film.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me ask you this: in writing this, what did you find was the most difficult part about it, about writing about this story?
Um, I that's a good question. It's it, again, because I feel like this story isn't mine and I'm just the conduit. I never have actually run into writer's block or
Yeah.
struggled with the story itself. It's been a slow process for sure, because I am one of those writers who's constantly, and this was true of my academic work too, I'm constantly going back and rereading and rewriting, and that's part of what spurs the story forward. So I'm not one of those that can just sit down and write the whole thing out and then go back. It's more of a slow, painstaking crafting effort. But I've never had that panic of, oh no, what am I going to say today? Because I trust the story itself. So I guess the hardest part has been just finding enough time,
Yeah.
honestly, to given how long it takes me to write,
Right.
um, to sit down and get the story out. And COVID really helped with that,
Yeah.
and particularly with finishing the first book and getting started on the second one. And since then, I've been able to sort of rearrange my life so that I can spend more time with writing, and I really sort of embraced that identity as a writer, and stepped away from some of my other professional horse activities. And then it's been challenging to develop at just the technical aspects, as I was saying, of being a writer, but I've had such good support from my editor, that it hasn't felt like a chore. It's felt like a real growth experience.
Yeah, of course. That's absolutely true. Which kind of leads into about thinking about reviews. And I first wanted to ask you, did you get yours today?
I did. Thank you. Yes.
Very welcome. We had the privilege at the Historical Fiction Company of reviewing Sarah's book, She Who Rides Horses, and we are happy to congratulate her on winning 5 stars and the highly recommended Award of Excellence. And if you want to know more about her review, it will be on the blog this week, and you'll be able to click on there and find out more about Sarah's books. But I have to ask you, so how do you deal with, like, reviews, bad ones and good ones?
I've been fortunate enough to mostly have good reviews, which has been really encouraging. And honestly, the critiques that I've had have been constructive, and I've learned from them. And the biggest sort of complaint, if you will, that I've gotten from readers is wanting the next book right away. Like,
that's a good thing.
Yeah, the first
good problem
book
to have.
literally ends on a cliff, on the edge of a cliff. It's a cliffhanger, and so that's the biggest reader feedback I've had is, where's the next book?
Right. Well, that's an excellent problem to have. Excellent.
Yeah, so I'm interested in talking about your main characters, so both, who they are, how they found their voice, and some of the both internal and external challenges that they face along their journey.
So when I started the book, that first chapter, she didn't even have a name. She was the girl for that entire first chapter, and it really took me a while to get to know her, to give her a name, to discover what she was like. So it's definitely a process of discovery, in the same way that you might get to know a new friend. And I found that my process of going back and rewriting, sometimes it took until the end of the first novel, or even the second novel, before I really understood who she was, what was motivating her. And then I had to go back and make sure that the seeds were there for the reader to follow as well. But it was a process for me getting to know Naya as much as for the reader to get to know her. And it was an unveiling, really.
That's awesome. So let me ask you this. In the process of you doing all of that, I'm sure you have, we all do have certain passages or certain things that really stand out to us as an author. Is there a particular passage in your own book that you really, really like?
I think the one that is sort of really central is where she first encounters, and it's in that first chapter, when she first encounters the red filly, and we're not really sure, and she's not even sure whether it's a dream that she's experiencing, whether she has come upon the filly in real life. But it's a moonlit night. She's out by herself on the steppe. She wanders into a ravine and finds the filly, and they have this sort of exchange, this nonverbal communication, this conversation almost, in which they discuss Naya's heart's desire. And I can read a little bit from the
Sure.
passage. She continued to study the young horse, considering what to do next. Suddenly, time ceased its normal passage, and in that moment, Naya's senses underwent an almost imperceptible shift. The moonlight became just a little brighter. The stream's murmur became just a little louder. The slight breeze rustling the leaves in the trees became just a little fresher against her skin. In the next moment, she seemed to feel the filly's thoughts. I will grant your heart's desire, but only if you are able to grant mine. And then later the filly says, after Naya's sort of surprised herself by saying what her real heart's desire is to ride on the filly's back, which is, no one has ever had that thought before.
Right.
And the red filly seems to reply, if this is indeed your deepest desire, then you must see with the eyes of your heart and create ties without the use of a rope. And when you have succeeded in granting my heart's desire, then shall yours be granted also. And that's the passage that really drives the whole story.
Oh, absolutely.
This being able to see with the eyes of your heart,
Mhm.
create ties without the use of a rope. These two creatures meeting one another's heart's desire.
I think that's brilliant. I think that's wonderful, and it kind of applies to a lot more things than just that. It kind of stretches out to the way things should be in life.
Well, and I do feel like, this story is about a choice point in time when horses were domesticated. And in the end, as humans, we may not have made the best choice in terms of our overall relationship, not just with horses, but with nature in general.
Right.
And there was a historical choice point, 6,000 years ago, but we're kind of revisiting that today, in where we are in the world at this moment. And the horses who've been with us through 6,000 years of history, and have pulled our plows and carried us into war, and they're still with us. And more, I think they're reminding us of what our choices were 6,000 years ago, and what the possibilities might be if we could reconsider what our relationship is, not just with horses, but with the natural world in general. So they still have something to teach us about connection and relationship, and following our heart's desire, and even being able to listen to our hearts.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like I said before about they can be such an inspiration. That is very true about horses and a lot of different animals.
Yeah, you're saying this about domesticating horses, and it's making me think about my pet dog who's scared of wind and tricycles. And so I sometimes think like, your ancestors were a wolf. And now it's like, if the wind is blowing a little too hard, she won't go outside.
So Sarah, let me ask you that with those thoughts in mind as well. Is there a particular quote that you live by?
So I'm a big fan of the poet David White. And he wrote a poem called What to Remember When Waking. And one of the lines in that poem is, and of course it's better in the context of the whole poem, but I'll just read the one phrase. He writes, "To become human is to become visible while carrying what is hidden as a gift to others." And I mentioned earlier that my horses had taken me on kind of a spiritual journey or a spiritual quest. And I think if I had to describe that journey, it has been to become human, to come into who I am meant to be.
Yeah.
And that can be a very vulnerable place. That's the part about becoming visible.
Yeah.
And then in the process, carrying what is hidden. We each have something hidden. That's the gift we're born with, and the gift that we're meant to bring into the world, as a gift to others. And so I do feel like this story coming to me and allowing me to become a storyteller has allowed me to become that much more human, and be able, and that much more vulnerable, and visible, and be able to bring my gift into the world for others.
Well, I think that's a beautiful quote to live by. Absolutely. And I know that you said that you are working on the third one now in the series.
Yeah, well, second and third. The second
third.
one I'm in the process of editing and revising, and then as I'm doing that, I am developing a much better sense of what will happen in the third book of the trilogy. So,
well, I know your fans are going to be thrilled to hear that that it's coming up. So, in addition to that, is there anything else that you have coming up?
Once I finish this trilogy, I have in mind a book that'll be set in the 14th century, based on someone who actually lived. Again, horses will be an element. The title of the book is going to be A True and Perfect Knight.
Oh,
And
I like that.
Yeah, that will present its own challenges of research.
Yes, it will.
But yeah, that should all be enough to keep me busy for the next decade, probably.
Probably so. Well, Sarah, we thank you so much for being on the show today. And we really enjoyed you being here. And we're so fascinated with your book. And again, everyone can go to the link in the description, podcast description, to go to Sarah's website, and also to the links to her books on Amazon. And thank you again, Sarah, for being here. We really appreciate it.
Well, my pleasure. It was nice to be able to talk with both of you, and thanks again.
And to all of our listeners, we thank you so much and ask that you please click on the subscribe button. And once again, you can learn more about Sarah and her books at www.sarahvbarnes.com. We hope everyone enjoyed the show today. And again, keep making history and keep listening.